Good morning. It's always an honor. It's a very humbling experience to be able to not only receive God's word, but then to share it. And I just think of some of these prophets. We're going to talk about a prophet today, but just to be imparted with something and to be the one that God chooses to spread that forth, and what amazing honor that is, to be able to stand up here and do that this morning. So I was kind of thinking as I was preparing this, how do we open, how do we start? And the greatest thing that you're probably not going to get anymore is my dad jokes. So we're going to start off. We're going to have a little fun this morning. I was going to tell a joke about time traveling, but you guys didn't like it, so I'm going to move on, and we're gonna go on from there. I got this. Come on this side. You gotta pick it up with him. All right. So, which bear is the most condescending? Where you at? A panda. Why are elevator jokes so classic and good? Because they work on so many levels. Two goldfish are in a tank. All right, picture this. Two goldfish in a tank. One says to the other, "Do you know how to drive this thing?" All right. You with me? Here we go. How does a penguin build his house? It glues them together. All right, last one. When does a joke become a dad joke? When it becomes apparent. All right. It's so good to laugh, and that's just something as we think about our time and what's next for us and for our family. But the memories we have, and the times we get to laugh together with our church, the times we've had to cry together with our church, and all the emotions in between. But we truly will miss our church family. And as God calls us on to this amazing opportunity that we're so excited for. But I think that's what's so hard about saying goodbye and moving to what God has for us next. I was saved in this church. I was baptized in this church. I met my wife at a youth group function in this church. Pastor Dave married us. All three of our boys were dedicated in this church. I received and answered my call to ministry right here. To say that we're going to miss this church family is just, it's an immense understatement. But I know that there's been people here, Pastor Dave, Pastor Eli, that's poured into my life as a dad, as a friend, as a leader, that's made me who I am today. And I know that there's something for everyone that can be a part of that. And Dave talked a couple weeks ago about, I'm the 8th, 9th? What is it, Dave, that you've sent forward? 9th. 9 pastors that Pastor Dave has sent from this place. That's an incredible church. That's not common. That doesn't just happen. That doesn't happen in churches all over the place for people to be sending forth. And those are intentional efforts that our leadership has in identifying those strengths in people, identifying areas where they would fit. And then once those are identified, finding and equipping those for the work, building up, strengthening, teaching, and then sending them out, and then reproducing that effort. And many of the pastors that have gone from this place, they've then redoubled that effort. They've trained up leaders. They've sent them out. And it just keeps happening over and over and over and again. And that's the Great Commission, living and breathing in the church. That as new leaders are sent out, that there's people that receive a call to their life of what's next for me. And I was thinking that the pastors that have gone before me, and I was reflecting on my journey at this time, and I could recall those times when the church was going to send out a pastor, one of these 8 that went before. And this natural question pops into my head, and it's, I wonder, this is what I do when I'm thinking real hard, pondering the things of life. I'm going to just, or maybe it's just what's for lunch, but I'm really thinking, I wonder who's going to take their place. I wonder who's going to lead their ministries. I wonder, and I just keep wondering, who's going to fill the holes left by people and leaders that go on. So I'm going to tell you a story this morning about Samuel Morse, and many of you may recognize that name, Samuel Morse. But Samuel Morse was born into a preacher's home in New England just 2 years after George Washington was elected the first president of the United States. After finishing his education at Yale, he went to England to hone his painting skills. Upon his return to America, he was recognized as a gifted artist and was soon in great demand. Morse's wife died while he was away from home painting in Washington, D.C. He did not receive the news until it was too late. In fact, he even missed his wife's funeral because horseback messaging and slow boats takes a long time. Samuel Morse, you may know Morse code, but he was also credited with the invention of the single-wire telegraph. That he didn't want anyone else to experience the heartache that he experienced because communications took too long. So he said, you know what, I'm going to do something about this. And he understood all the gifts and the talents and the abilities to fill that need, and he recognized that he had those. He had that kind of giftings. And he plunged himself into this work to make this happen. That people no longer would be missing things that were of great importance. That people would no longer have to suffer like he did in this time. And I would say that we've all benefited from his accomplishments and those foundations of the accomplishments that he's had. And the future pioneers of technology built on his work, and then they built on their work. And it was in those times of me wondering who's going to step up, and I heard this voice, what about you? That's a scary voice, church. When God speaks that into your life, because there's a crisis moment there. When God asks, what about you? I can either take this scary leap of faith, or I can just continue doing what I'm doing. And it's a hard question. Now I'm not going to say that I began right away with the right answer. I actually had all sorts of answers for why not me. I felt like Moses in this time of why not me. Why I can't do this. I have a family. I'm way too busy. God, you don't know all the stuff that I got in my life. The things going on. I got work. I got school. I got kids. You know, I don't do well standing in front of a crowd, Lord. You got the wrong person. I'm not smart enough. I don't speak well enough. On and on and on about why not me. But eventually God helps me move past my own perception of my shortcomings, my own perception of my shortcomings, and on and into places where I could serve, where I could grow, where I could develop. He put people around me that could help me see things in my life that I couldn't even see in myself. That I started to be willing to listen to those that were saying it And then I could begin to actually see myself in the places God was calling me to. And I don't know where you stand today, but there are plenty of opportunities to minister to God's people. Pastor Dave was just talking about so many of them. From simple acts like putting some candy in a bucket and being an ear to listen when people want to talk. There's no shortage of ways to minister to our church, to our community, in our schools, in our workplaces. And there's no shortage of ministries in the church, right here, right now. And that's the purpose of today's message. Because we put God in a box, and then we say, a lot of we's here, that we are incapable of all sorts of things. Because we got God in this little box. And then, God, I don't know how I can do this. But do we really not think that if God calls us to do something, that He's not going to provide the way to see it through? That He's not going to help us to understand the ways to get it done? And when we surrender to that idea, some amazing things are going to happen. And that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at some of those amazing things where God moved in people's lives because they were, one, willing, and they were faithful, and they were obedient to that call. That what about you? What about me? So turn with me this morning to 1 Kings chapter 18. We're going to start in verse 1. Over the past several weeks, we've been covering Elijah in our men's group and looking at his life and the crazy roller coaster that the prophet Elijah found himself on, and just the situations that were constantly put in front of him. But so just a little bit of backstory. If you don't know much about Elijah, he found himself called to be a prophet in the time of King Ahab. And there was some evil kings that came up after David and Solomon. There were some evil kings. There were some kings that didn't do right in the ways of the Lord. There were some kings that maybe looked away from things that they shouldn't have, or allowed things to happen, allowed idol worship to happen when it shouldn't have happened, and turned a blind eye. But then on the scene comes Ahab and Jezebel. And Ahab not only allows things to happen, but now he's the one pushing these things to happen. It's not that this stuff just happens under his watch. He is now the tool that's bringing the Baal worship and the Asherah poles and all these different things to happen. And it says that he did more evil than anyone else before him. Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. So he's not a good dude. And this is where God calls Elijah to serve. He is the mouthpiece at this point, and we see that God has some great plans for Elijah. He's got a great purpose. And through this time of evil, there's a drought on the land. There's famine. There hasn't been rain in 3.5 years up to this point where we're starting, because of the sin in the land right now. And 3.5 years of rain, when we think about drought here in Farmington, which that's like all the time, we got to think of what does that drought actually mean for us? When it gets really bad, maybe we have to stop using the car wash, have to water our lawns every other day, right? It impacts us, but I don't think we truly understand what a drought in Mesopotamia meant 3,000 years ago. When your sole livelihood is based on your crops and what grows from the field, a drought, even a 6-month drought, is huge. But a drought for 3.5 years, things are going to start getting really bad. You're going to stop eating. There's no water to drink. So just kind of put yourself in this place where the Elijah and company find themselves, and God, here's God's grace, and God's grace, His incredible grace, is just permeated through not only this passage, but through all of the Elijah passages here. That God wants the best things for His people. God wants the greatest things, and He's going to continue to pursue and give these greater things to His people. But He wants everyone to know where this came from, where this gift comes from, what people might think that it came from, and where it actually came from. And the God of the people that Baal was pushing, that Jezebel was pushing, was Baal. Baal was the fertility god, and he was also known as the Lord of the rain and the dew. So, drought for 3.5 years, and they're worshiping the God of the rain. So, if God was just to put rain on the land right now, there might be some confusion about where it came from. Oh, we've been praying to Baal. Baal, he was asleep, but he woke up, right? But God doesn't want there to be any confusion. He's going to make sure Baal is discredited, that there's no question about who is God, who's the actual God of the rain, who actually commands creation, and who doesn't. It's the who's who of the God. It's which God is real at this point. And we're going to pick up in this passage about Elijah and Obadiah in chapter 18, verse 1. And it says, "After a long time, in the 3rd year, the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Go present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land." So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria, and Ahab had summoned Obadiah, his palace administrator. Obadiah was a devout believer in the Lord. While Jezebel was killing off the Lord's prophets, Obadiah had taken 100 prophets and hidden them in 2 caves, 50 in each, and had supplied them with food and water. Ahab had said to Obadiah, "Go through the land to all the springs and valleys. Maybe we can find some grass to keep the horses and mules alive, so we will not have to kill any of our animals." So they divided the land they were to cover, Ahab going in one direction, Obadiah in another. So here we're introduced to Obadiah. Obadiah is an administrator. And we're going to see Obadiah and Elijah working. But Obadiah is the palace administrator. He's working in the background. He's using his gifts the way he knows how. And his gifts, and we're going to notice, and that's going to be what we're going to key on here, is his gifts are very different than Elijah's. We're going to see Elijah, he's the big production. He's the upfront guy. He's charismatic. He speaks well. He's going to do some great things. But here on this side, we see Obadiah working in the background. We see him doing the things that he knows how to do. He sees a need that Jezebel is killing God's prophets, God's spokesmen, and he's figuring out how to move things in places and save this remnant of prophets, save God's mouthpieces. And he's working in his strengths right here. And it's interesting to see, while he's doing this, what are Ahab's priorities? This is the government of the time. What are his priorities? It's about feeding the animals. You know, the people are in a drought. They're dying, and he's concerned with watering the animals and killing the animals. The commodities, the economy. No concern here for the people. And that's where God's people is called to step up. So verse 7. As Obadiah was walking along, Elijah met him. Obadiah recognized him, bowed down to the ground, and said, "Is it really you, my lord Elijah?" "Yes," he replied. "Go tell your master Elijah is here." And his master, we know, is Ahab. Ahab's already tried to kill Elijah. Ahab doesn't like Elijah, knows the kind of destruction he could bring on him. And Ahab doesn't want any part of Elijah. And so he asked, "What have I done wrong?" asked Obadiah, "that you are handing your servant over to Ahab to be put to death?" There's some trepidation here. There's some fear. "As surely as the Lord your God lives, there is not a nation or kingdom where my master has not sent someone to look for you. And whenever a nation or kingdom claimed that you were not there, he made them swear they could not find you. But now you tell me to go to my master and say, 'Elijah is here.' I don't know where the Spirit of the Lord may carry you when I leave. If I go and tell Ahab and he doesn't find you, he will kill me." He's scared. It's hard to do what he's been called to do at this point. But he says, "Yet I, your servant, have worshipped the Lord since my youth. Haven't you heard, my Lord, what I did while Jezebel was killing the prophets of the Lord? I hid 100 of the Lord's prophets in 2 caves, 50 in each, and supplied them with food and water. And now you tell me to go to my master and say, 'Elijah is here. He will kill me.' Elijah said, 'As the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, I will surely present myself to Ahab today.'" So throughout this, Obadiah sees what God's called him to. He understands the calling and what needs to be done, but that doesn't mean it's easy. That doesn't mean it's just a slam dunk, I'm going to go do it. He knows there's a real risk to his body at this point. There's a real risk to his life, his livelihood, and for those around him. And in this, he can kind of see God at work. In Elijah, I love this, and this is key for us here this morning. Elijah helps him put things in perspective. In verse 15, he says, "As the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, I will surely present myself to Ahab today." God's will be done. God is going to move today. Things are going to happen. You get to choice. Are you going to be a part of it? Are you going to be the hands and feet that help bring this forward? Or are you going to be on the sidelines? Are you going to sit this one out? We have a choice. He had a choice. And he chose right. Because he was devout. He was faithful. Even though there was some fear there. And some trepidations. He understood what will happen when he's on board. And that's the key. And we're gonna continue reading here about the great things he would do. But keep in mind that it first took a yes on his part. It first took all right, I don't know where this is going, but let's see. Let's see where this takes me. Verse 16, I love this story. This is just amazing, God at work, and the things that he does when people are obedient and willing to put themselves out there. We see Elijah on Mount Carmel. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" "I have not made trouble for Israel," Elijah replied, "but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's command, and you have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table." So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets of Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions? How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him." Then Elijah said to them, "I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and then cut it into pieces and put it on the wood. but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God." Then all the people said, "What you say is good." Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose one of the bulls and prepare it first. Since there are so many of you, call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire." So they took the bull given them, and they prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. "Baal, answer us," they shouted, but there was no response. No one answered, and they danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. "Shout louder," he said. "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought. Or busy, or maybe he's traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time of the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come here to me." They came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of them, and the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Your name shall be Israel." With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord. He dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, "Fill 4 large jars with water, and pour it on the offering of the wood, on the wood." "Do it again," he said. And they did it again. "Do it a third time," he ordered, and they did it the third time. The water ran down the altar and even filled the trench. What's he doing here, church? He's making sure that everyone knows who God is. Keep putting some water on it. Keep putting some water on it. Nobody can say that this spark came from anywhere else. Drench it in water. At the time of sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and he prayed. Prays a very simple prayer. "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, and answer me, so these people will know that you, the Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice. The wood and the stones and the soil also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." When we're obedient, we're faithful, God goes before us, and then we're able to work in His power. Not in our power, not in the things that we can do, but in God's power and what He's doing. Just look at this God we serve in this passage. And when we understand who this God is we serve, it should embolden us. It should want us, to help us to see what we can do in that. You see, geography was no hindrance for our God. Mount Carmel, where Elijah goes and calls these prophets to be, Mount Carmel is known as Baal's sanctuary. This is the mountain of Baal. He's like, you know what? You guys get home field advantage on this one. I'm going to come into your place. I'm going to come into the mountain of your God, and I'm going to bring my God. Numbers are of no consequence. We see the 450 prophets of Baal. We see the 400 prophets of Asherah. 850, they wouldn't even fit in this room. There's going to be so many of them. And Elijah's standing there before them with his God. Activity is no inducement. We see the dancing and the chanting. And then when that wasn't working and Elijah starts taunting them, we see this frenzy. And then we're going to start cutting ourselves. We're just more activity for their God. But that's not Elijah here. And look, Elijah's not casual. He's earnest, he's intense. But he knows God's nature. He knows the God he serves. He knows God's going to do what he said he's going to do. God, you called me to this, and you're going to be here with me as I do it. He didn't have to badger, coerce, or manipulate God like they were trying to do to Baal. He didn't need to blabber on. He didn't need to bleed half to death. He communicated with God and understood God's will, and through Elijah's obedience and willingness, God was going to work, and he knew that. Handicaps are no obstacle. We already talked about these handicaps of geography and numbers, but that's still not enough for God to make sure that everyone knows what he's doing is from him and from no one else. We see that the dousing of this offering 3 times. Pour the water on it. Pour the water on it again. Do it again. Fill the trench below it, just so nobody could say there's some sparks that came up. And then the prayer, and then God did what he said he would do. God wanted to extend the grace, his grace, to the people, which they obviously didn't deserve. That's why it's grace. Even when Elijah draws the line in the sand, choose the God of Israel or choose Baal, they did nothing. They're like, we're gonna kind of watch this and see how it plays out, and then we'll kind of make a choice. They didn't deserve the grace that God was extending them, but these were God's people, and he was going to continue to pursue them and to bless them. And God chose Obadiah and Elijah to see this through. This whole passage, we see Obadiah working on the back end. We see Elijah, he's the up front. He's the speaker. But one thing I want to point out about Obadiah, he's not the up front guy. He's not the guy standing in front of the people, but he was faithful to the call. He was the one working in the backgrounds. He was the one taking care of things that people never see. Most people, outside of this passage in the day, probably never knew what he did. They never understood that this was Obadiah working. They see Elijah. He's up front. Everyone knows Elijah. Even Obadiah recognized him when he saw him. But Obadiah was still faithful in his calls. His gifts were not Elijah's gifts. He could have easily begun comparing himself to Elijah. Well, I'm not this. I can't speak like that. I'm not bold enough to get in front of all these prophets. That's not who I am. And he could have started second-guessing his own abilities and what he could have done. But God didn't create Obadiah to be Elijah. He created Obadiah to be Obadiah. He used Obadiah in his giftings to do great things. Throughout this passage, these prophets were saved. Obadiah connects Ahab. He sees it through. Something I want you to see here, church, today, that faithfulness is not so dull that it comes in one flavor. Faithfulness is not so dull that it comes in only one flavor, that fits in one mold, in one box. Your pride required the correction this story can give. You are not called to great works, but good works. You're not called to flamboyant ministry, but to a faithful ministry. Not to be a dashing servant, but to be a devoted one. The service of God was very real in both of these, even though it looked different. God was asking one to do something and one to do something else, and that's where we find ourselves today. Is I don't have the giftings of Pastor Dave or Pastor Eli, but God gave me gifts and strengths and abilities. And you have those as well, just like I did, even when I couldn't see them. So as the band comes back to the stage this morning, 1 Corinthians 12, 4 through 6 Paul tells us there are different kinds of spiritual gifts, but the same Spirit is the source of them all. There are different kinds of service, but we serve the same Lord. God works in different ways, but it is the same God who does the work in all of us. Church, where's your gifts? Where are your strengths? What is it that God's been in your head about, the what about yous? Where do you fit? And maybe you don't know, honestly, but there's people here that could help and to identify and help you to see where your strengths might be. And I'm not just talking about filling holes from me as I'm leaving. This church and every church has lots of places where you could fit and be a part of the team and be a part of what God is doing. Be your part and get to see those amazing blessings. What do you think Elijah and Obadiah was after God licks that fire up? Like, man, we were a part of that. I was a part of that. I did that with God. Our little ones need loved on. Our kids need men and women willing to invest in their lives and their spiritual development. Our teens, we need help in the office. Help at events like we just had last week, where this church came together and they poured themselves out for this community, that they could feel that love. Maybe it's in the tech team. Maybe it's on the worship team. Benevolence, visitation, hospitality, women's ministry, men's ministries, behind the scenes, up front. You'll never know what you're capable of until you answer that question. Just be willing to be used and then be intentional about being used. God chose the church to be the implement, to take the gospel message into the world. God chose us. And here's that line in the sand. Are we gonna jump on board? Are we gonna be willing to be used? Or are we gonna continue to find excuses why it's not us? Why it's not me? Who is going to answer the call to become the church? Bow your heads with me. In the book of Matthew, Jesus said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few." My first question this morning is for those that may think they're not good enough, they're not capable enough, they're just not enough to be a leader, to be a servant, to be used by God. And if you think that this morning, I want to pray against that spirit of fear, against that spirit of timidity, that God would show you He's bigger than that. That He's a God that is so greater than the box we put Him in. That He can do some amazing things, and He can do them with whatever shortcomings you might think you have. That He's got such greater things for you this morning. And I would pray that you would see that and understand that. And then the second question is just for anyone willing to answer that call this morning. It's for those that are willing to say, "Here I am, Lord, use me." I don't know what it looks like. I don't even know what I'm going to be called to. But here I am, Lord. Use me. I want you to think about that as we sing this song.